how do you see companies as actually communicating the cultures that they build and sort of spreading the word to employees, whether they're brand new or have been around for decades? How do companies keep infusing that culture throughout their workforce?
So thank you very much, Heather, and greetings to everyone all around the world. It's lovely to have such a wide range of group of people with us. So to answer your question, I guess if we think about culture, normally we think about it in three levels, from the most obvious, which is what people say, kind of espousals. Then you have the kind of artifacts which back that up, and then underlying that are the deeper values. Now, typically the way in which people kind of communicate, or companies would try to build culture, has often been through the kind of what people are saying, the kind of nice words that people would say during a town hall, and what's repeated by leaders in an organization. But also they would use the kind of artifacts, right? So these kind of things like the office, the space around you, the kind of foosball tables, or whatever is around in kind of physical space would be kind of reminders of the culture. And the interesting thing is with the pandemic, and prior to the pandemic and now, a lot of that is gone, right? So you've moved from this kind of situation where you have a culture which is communicated through these artifacts, which are space and objects and things, and a culture which is to a culture which is more communicated by kind of words. So people appear and talk about things in a virtual town hall or meet a little bit. So I think that's one big shift we're seeing, and that has quite big implications, I think, of a movement from a kind of a thick culture where all of your all of your senses are being kind of reminded and triggered to kind of to reinforce that culture, to a rather thin culture where the culture is just coming to you on the screen, which is in front of you, right? And that means that as soon as you shut the screen off or walk away from it, that culture can also sort of shut off. It's not sort of around you and surrounding you. And that brings a whole series of very new challenges, I think, to any manager.
Yeah, I mean, especially now with, we're supposedly in the era of the Great Resignation, and people are walking away from jobs, and maybe it's easier to do that when you don't feel culturally connected to a place. What can companies do to counteract that thinning of their cultures?
So this is I guess the struggle, the reason why many of the people are on this call today is trying to figure that out. So I think there's a range of things. The first thing is that some companies which were doing this beforehand. So one very famous example of a company or organization which had a work from anywhere policy was the US Patent Office. And what they had done before is that essentially they would allow people to come in initially, and then they'd work from home a number of days a week, as long as they lived kind of within the Virginia area near the patent office in the US. But then they decided to move towards a kind of not a work from home and come into the office some days, but a work from anywhere policy. But the key twist that they added is your first 2 years in the job, you need to spend near the office and come in a few days a week, so you learn the culture. But then after that, you can kind of go and live in Nebraska and live on a ranch and enjoy horse riding or whatever you might do. Now, that's going to work for big organizations, right? But for very smaller organizations or faster and flexible ones, it might not work. So you have to think about other ways in which you might go about doing this. And there's a range of things that some companies have come up with. One is like temporary co-location. So you might say a few days for a couple of times a year, everyone might come together in a particular spot and spend time together to kind of reinforce that culture. Another one might be having remote communities of practice, where people who might be living in an area within, say, a couple of hours drive or train ride, depending on where you are, you come together, you spend some time together talking about the kind of water cooler chats that you might otherwise have, that brings people together and reinforces the culture. But there's also sort of virtual solutions here. So we've heard, I think we'll probably hear from the next two panelists discussions about how you can, leverage virtual solutions for this. But I think the key thing becomes really the best way, and what a lot of the evidence shows now, is that the way in which culture is communicated and reinforced is not through words, what people say, but through practices, what people do. So it becomes kind of this reinforcement through day-to-day practices. The kinds of things people do and how they communicate becomes perhaps the most important aspect.